Good morning. I would like to thank Al-Farabi Kazakh National University, the Department of Religious and Culture Studies, for this opportunity to give class on religion, mysticism, and art. In this course, we're going to see how art, representation of religious aspects, evolves from a public representation towards a more personal, sometimes a spiritual and mystical form of representation. This second type of representation can be described with the term numinous, as we will see later. In these photographs, you can see how in different cultures, some forms of religion have been used as performative aspects in order to attract a communal spirit in the participants in the ceremony. This is often called ritual. This is another example of Mayan culture, how some monuments were also built in order to have people visualize the ritual that was performed on the top. But we also have other types of art in which the representation of the intimate experience of spirituality is portrayed. In this slide, you have two examples of the Annunciation, one by Fra Angelico in the 15th century, and one contemporary 20th century John Waterhouse, an English artist from the Pre-Raphaelite movement. In both of these, you can see the transition from the public space to the private space. And in both examples, we have some kind of instrument that separates the two areas. In the first picture, we have a column that separates Mary and the angel who tells her she's going to be the mother of Christ. And in the second, the same image, but instead of a column, we have water, because for the English artists, particularly the Pre-Raphaelite, water was also an important element for the division of realms, of reality and the supernatural. And water is not only popular in Celtic myths and religious beliefs, but also in other cultures such as the Egyptian, the Nordic cultures, and so on. Architecture also reflects these differences between the public aspects of representation of religion and the more intimate, mystical aspects of spiritual experience. For example, in the Sufi experience, we have architectural spaces which look for more intimate relation with the metaphysical, the supernatural, and how there are no elements to allow the distraction of the person who is meditating. In Christian beliefs, monasteries were designed for this intimate experience. Monks and nuns in some monasteries had no access to the exterior, and the monasteries were designed with a yard in the center where a garden was placed so that monks and nuns could walk and meditate without having to go into the external world. In more ancient beliefs, such as Greek, Orphic beliefs, other types of enclaves and places were used to carry out ritual and illuminating ceremonies. One example is the Orphic rites, the Orphic in honor of Orpheus, the god of dreams and sleep. And caves were often used for this kind of ritualistic experience. In this example, you can see one from the region of southern Bulgaria. It has the shape of a woman's womb because in these ancient religions were linked also to natural philosophies, where the goddess was adorated. It was conceived as a special representation of life because of women's power to give life. And in the other picture by William Waterhouse, you have the representation of Orpheus again in the water, because again the water is a symbol of the transition between the realm of reality and the realm of the metaphysical. Other cultures use motifs and patterns for meditation. One example is the Buddhist culture, where temples are often constructed in the form of a mandala. Penitent should follow certain steps and certain movements in order to perform the ritual and prayers. This is an example of Borobudur temple in Java, and this is an example of Angkor Wat temple in Cambodia, which is also designed in the form of a mandala. An example of Maya culture in Mexico also uses patterns, repetitive patterns, in order to attract concentration in meditation and prayer. Christian beliefs, for example, they also use the rosary and beads in order to repeat certain prayers over and over. So repetition and pattern is also very important in meditation and praying, particularly in intimate experiences with the spiritual world. In contemporary art, many artists are going to use what is called in Latin via negativa, the negative way, which is the isolation from perception. So they will either use black, absolute black, or absolute white in order to make the attention of the person concentrate in nothing else but the black or the white color. This is the case of American artist Mark Rothko, who uses this black canvas. Is a huge installation. It's meaning it's the language of abstraction and meditation. In the following slides, we're going to look at the evolution of some of the topics which are repetitive across different religions, and we're going to follow a historical approach which will concentrate on a certain number of symbols and patterns from the very ancient Neolithic times to contemporary day. Okay, so one of those examples of repetitive patterns is the representation of the most important god as the sun. In ancient cultures, the sun was conceived as the creator, the most important aspect in human life. So here we can see different representations of the sun from Neolithic period, the early years before Christ. On the left, you can see, for example, Konark, which is the sun temple in India. You can see also some Neolithic representations in caves in the Crimea Peninsula. In the center, you can see an example of Okunev culture from the 2nd century before Christ in southern Siberia. And also on the right-hand side, another example of Siberian petroglyphs, also dating before Christ. You can see how the sun is represented in various ways, sometimes like a disc or a wheel, sometimes in a spiral form. These are other examples of Turkic representations of the sun, which can also take these patterns. We can find these patterns as far away as Mexico. So it's interesting that the same patterns occur across very wide spectrum of territories. The image of the spiral, for example, is found in Spain in various places, particularly in the Canary Islands, in Tenerife, and also in the north of Spain. But you have examples there from a beach in Hawaii, and you have also examples from Mexico, a petroglyph beach in Alaska. It's interesting that this kind of representation can sometimes refer to the sun, but also to water and perhaps even to water animals. Like these ones on the right-hand side of your screen, the hagfish, which is one of the oldest water worms living today. And when in fossil form, it takes the form of a spiral. So this can also maybe refer to the very important event on the life of the Earth, which was the flood. Some of these representations appear in a wide spectrum of artists. Here we have, for example, William Blake. William Blake is a proto-romantic artist, English. He was a member of the Royal Society. He was a Freemason. So here we have also the signs of Freemasonry, which are, for example, the triangle, the spiral. In the top picture you have Newton, and he is drawing on a paper which is rolled up like a spiral. In the lower picture you can see some of the symbols of alchemy, which is the sun, symbolizing the man aspects of the universe, the masculine, and the moon, which symbolizes the feminine aspects. And also you can see in the center of the picture this other figure holding the compass in the shape of a triangle. Also stands for a pyramid sometimes, for number 3, which is the spiritual number for eternity, because number 3 encompasses past, present, and future. In the right-hand side of the screen, you can see another picture of the creator. For Freemasonry, the creator, God, is addressed as the architect of the universe, but you can see how he's also portrayed as the sun. And these are some images from more contemporary artists, Vasily Kandinsky, where you can see some of the same patterns, even though Kandinsky is going to use figurative art, so sometimes it's hard to recognize the elements. But you can see on the lower part of your screen the spiral, which also usually has 4 circles, and you can see there numerous spirals with different colors. On the other side of the screen, you can see this figure, which looks like some kind of totem or bird form, and it is easy to distinguish the sun and the moon, which, as we have seen, are also alchemic symbols and important symbols also in Masonry. This figure is made up of triangles all over. And the dark pattern, the lower one that you can see there, it's like 2 birds in circular form, almost like the yin-yang logo or pattern in a circular movement. And still you can distinguish in this painting the sun disk in white on the top part of the image, and the moon also white on the lower part of the image. This is another painting by Kandinsky, where we have a bird which is clearly identified by the eyes and the big, large eyes. I take this to symbolize the goddess, the owl that usually accompanies the goddess. It's a symbol of wisdom. It's the bird of the night. This is Inanna, Sumerian, Babylonian Ishtar, and later also known as Aphrodite and Venus in Greek and Roman cultures. And the goddess stands for the symbol of life. So for birth and creation, but also for death. And normally the feminine is, as we mentioned, is associated with the night, with the moon. And so this is why we have the bird, which is a night bird, the owl. These are some examples of your own culture, the Tangreism in Kathak culture. Here we're going to introduce another element that is visible in many religious representations from ancient times to contemporary art, which is the axis mundi. In the drum that you can see on the top of the image, this is a traditional drum from Kazakh culture, and you can see the three realms of the world. The heaven, the supernatural world on the upper part, the middle part which represents the earth, the material world, and the underworld, which is the lower part. Here in the drum appears as empty. Okay? The representation of this man in the center of the image, it also functions as an axis mundi, a kind of line that connects the three universes. And it is interesting because it also seems to be squatting. His legs are like bent, and this is why I have used some petroglyphs of rock art with the squatter man, which it's a widespread example all over the world. And on the right top hand, you have an example of the top of one of your yurts, your traditional nomad houses, which are built in the shape of a sun, and the top part is open to leave out the smoke of the fire, which is lit inside of the yurt. But it also has, as I mentioned, the shape of the sun, and it's also open because it connects with the supernatural world. It's the connection. It's a kind of axis mundi with the supernatural world. A couple of examples from contemporary art. On the left here you have the shape of the yurt, which is circular, and a space is organized following very strict rules. This kind of design for ancient houses is not only common in Kathak culture. Of course, it's very popular in Mongolia, Inner Mongolia areas, and all the Altai area. But also, interestingly, it holds similarities with other cultures which are far away, such as the Celtic culture in Ireland, for example, where the constructions were circular, and they also had some kind of aperture in the center of the construction in order to connect with the upper world, with the supernatural world, through some kind of axis mundi. On the right hand side, you have an example of Rothko's chapel in Houston, which is a non-denominational space, and which it also uses this kind of semicircle pattern. And you can see, again, he uses the negative way, the via negativa, with no decoration whatsoever, in order to help absolute concentration of the people meditating and praying. Okay, so here you have the classical representation of the three realms: the heaven, the dwelling place of the god or gods, depending on the religion. And then we have the earth, the Middle Earth, which is the middle realm, and we have the underworld underneath the earth. This is, as I said, this kind of pattern is very repetitive in many cultures. One example of axis mundi, which is very common across cultures, is the tree. Here you can see, for example, some examples of different trees from Sumerian to Java. In all of them, you can distinguish the tree with two beings. Usually, they are winged beings. They have wings, and they are a mixture. Often, they are a mixture of animal and human. They are normal. They are called cherubs or cherubins sometimes, and in Christian religion, they become angels. So here are two more examples of in Indian jungle and in Angkor Wat in Cambodia, where you can distinguish the tree again as the most important image in the painting or in the carving. How there are a number of people on both sides guarding this axis mundi. The tree connects the three realms, because the tree is also like the triangle. It represents past, present, and future. The past are the roots, the present is the trunk, and the branches represent the future. These are some examples of cherubs or cherubins. They are sometimes bulls with the face of humans. Also, sometimes other types of animals like lions. And you have examples there from the gate of Khorshabad at the Louvre Museum. You have another example from the palace of Ashur-Nashirpal in Nimrud. You have Phoenician cherubim on a bronze platter, which was found at Delphi dating from the 8th century before Christ. Another form of representation of the axis mundi is the ladder or staircase. For example, on the left, or here on the picture, you have William Blake's Jacob's Ladder, the story of Jacob's dream and how he sees this staircase that helps him reach heaven. And along this staircase, again, we can see all the angels that are guiding him. On the other image, it's by Fra Angelico, is the Coronation of the Virgin. You can see how the painting is almost theatrical, and of course the spiritual figures, the holy figures, are elevated over the heads of the ordinary people who are watching and adorating these figures. Other examples of trees here you can see in Babylonian cylinder seals when representing Marduk. In these images, sometimes the spiral is also used, and sometimes the solar disk as well. In the story of Gilgamesh, we also have such patterns, and in the representation of Gilgamesh, in the right-hand side of here, you can see the Enki and how they are also near the tree of life, which functions as an axis mundi. And here you can see a contemporary painting by Karl Otto Gotz from 1947, which is also representing the elements of the Epic of Gilgamesh with contemporary aspects. Another important thing to mention is that in religious art, we have very important syncretic forms. There are always mixtures of one religion and other religions. For example, alongside Christian representations, such as the one here of the Virgin and Child, which is a 3rd century fresco in the catacomb of Priscilla in Rome, we can find many other Roman representations of Roman beliefs. For example, on the left-hand side, you have a representation of Zeus and Hercules in the Garden of Hesperides, and then you have a representation there of the tree with the snake as well, which was later taken by Christianity to represent the devil. But the snake in other cultures was a kind of guardian, and even has positive aspects in Indian religion, with the snake that bites its own tail and represents eternity, Ouroboros. And also in Chinese culture, the snake, and in this case a huge snake-like dragon, is associated with good luck and good prospects. Another example of representations in art is death in religious art. Death, of course, it's a very important topic in religion. Many religions, most religions, try to offer opportunities to reach the realm of the supernatural, to reach heaven after death. And this is an installation by Bill Viola, a very famous contemporary artist who creates installations in different museums, and it's a triptych with different videos, different video projections, which represent different parts of human life: birth, life, and death. And in the middle one, he uses water as well to represent this being, because of course we are water beings. Most of the physical material aspect that makes us as human is water. In this other one, he calls it visions of time, and he uses the 4 elements from traditional Greek philosophy: fire, earth, wind, and water. These 4 elements used to represent the material world. Number 4 was a number associated to them, and the figure to represent them was the square, alongside the number 3 and the triangle, which represented the eternity. This is a contemporary representation of it's called Sephiroth by Anselm Kiefer, a neo-expressionist German painter, and attempting to represent aspects of transcendence. Transcendence is another topic that we're going to see, how it evolves from the representation of a very clear separation between the 3 realms: the material world, the supernatural world of heaven, and the underworld. And it evolves towards a more sort of personal, spiritual way of understanding the transcendence through what we have mentioned before, through this via negativa, this negative way, which simplifies all kind of perception and reduces perception to a minimum number of elements. This is an example of Dali representing death in Christianity. It's the symbol of John of the Cross, St. John of the Cross, and it's the Christ of St. John of the Cross. And it's unusual because of the way it is painted in a perspective which is not the usual one. In Christianity, the death of Christ symbolizes his success, his over death, because of his resurrection. So instead of being a negative symbol, normally it is a positive symbol. It symbolizes that everybody, all Christians, will also resurrect after death. It's interesting, however, how the studies that Dali painted for this portrait have triangular shapes, again, symbol of eternity, and also the symbol, what it seems to be the symbol of creation, of the associated to the goddess, to the feminine aspects of creation, because one of the drawings there has very strong parallels to feminine reproductive apparatus. And these are some examples from Kazimir Malevich, a 20th century artist, where we have some symbols. We have the cross, which traditionally represents resurrection and the triumph over death. But in Malevich's work, colors and the shapes seem to have some kind of negative connotations. There is also one image there in the center where we have the sun image and the eye. We will see that the eye is also another of the elements which is present in the representation of angels, particularly a certain kind of angels, which are the cherubs, which seem to be watching over the gateway to the supernatural realm, to heaven. Remember, we saw them next to the tree of life as well, guarding the tree, which is the connection, the axis mundi. Other paintings by Kazimir Malevich. The first one is called Oaks and Dryads, and you can see again the tree, symbol of axis mundi. In this case, the emphasis is on the lower part of the tree. That is actually the roots, or the parts connected to the past, and also the trunk, which symbolizes the present. All the branches of the tree have images of women, and some of these women are pregnant. So again, there is a link between natural approaches to religion, the symbol of the goddess and fertility rites, and mixing also with some eyes that seem to be around the tree, like the guardians. And on the other picture, it's a prayer study for a fresco painting, and you can see the person meditating. It's a very simple painting with not very many colors, again to symbolize the meditative aspects. But it's interesting how there is a kind of halo, or a kind of a sun around the person who is meditating. This kind of solar disc, it's often placed behind sacred figures in Christianity, also to symbolize that they are saints. These are some studies of La Pietà, which is at Vatican. One is by Edouard Manet, and the other one is by Hans Fronius, both from the from the 20th century and the other one from the 19th century. They're very different to the original sculpture, but you can identify some of the similar elements. The emphasis on the figure of Christ. In the case of Hans Fronius, it looks like almost like someone begging in the street with this dish, and it looks the body very weakened. Whereas the Edouard Manet's figure, it's striking because of the clarity associated to the figure. It makes him stand out. It seems almost like if he is not dead, so he's resurrecting. The figure is very real, almost like a photograph, in comparison to the angels behind. The two women are portrayed as angels and with wings and in a more sort of pictorial way. And this is another contemporary image of Study for Crucifixion by Abraham Ratner, using some kind of cubist aspects. And again, as we mentioned, the cross symbolizing death and the triumph over death, painted in colors that are very bright in order to reach the eye very, very quickly, and make us notice that they are the most important elements in the painting. And some criticism as well of the cross, how religion is not helping to solve some of the world's problems. Here we have Leon Ferrari's two examples of the Christ, the Western civilization, he calls the Western Christian civilization, Christ on a bomber, how wars are being, how religion, how wars are fought in the name of religion, and also the center picture criticizing the army mechanical school with this detail of the Last Judgment by Menin in the background, and Andres Serrano's controversial Peace Christ, which caused huge controversy and was also destroyed while on display. These are some studies by Andy Warhol on the Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. These are some figurative aspects of resurrection. Here, contemporary artists do not use the cross so much. As you can see, there are other forms of representing the transcendent, as using these light elements, and how resurrection, how the floating images, and also people looking up, like hoping something will happen from up above, from the supernatural realm that will save them. Alongside death and the representation of death through the cross and aspects of the transcendence, we also have the image of the labyrinth and the descent of the underworld. These are two elements which symbolize the difficulties and the tests that people have to undergo in life in order to get to paradise, in order to get to the supernatural. So one element is the labyrinth, and another is the katabas, is the descent into the underworld. We will see later the different types of labyrinth, but first we will concentrate on katabasis, which is the descent into the underworld. And this has been represented in many different religions. One very classic example appears in Ovid's Metamorphoses, where we have several heroes who have to descend into the underworld in order to fulfill some test. But we also have this presence in Indian art. You have there an angel showing how to Yudhishthira. You have another display there showing how Odysseus also consulted prophet Tiresias in the Odyssey. Orpheus himself traveled to the underworld following the shade of his wife Eurydice. Normally, they return from the underworld, demonstrating that they can defeat death and achieve immortality. Normally, the descent of the underworld, it's accompanied by the appearance of devils and horrific figures. Normally, many of them hybrid between, something between a man and an animal. This is an example of Siberian mythology, and also present in Kazakh. Enrilik was the first creation of Ulgan, the creator god, but his pride led him to friction, and he was banished into the underworld. And in Kazakh mythology, he's the son of Tengri. These are some representations of hell in Islamic culture. Islamic culture is very difficult to find visual examples because visual representations of images are forbidden. Everything is based on the word and the verses of the Quran. So it's very difficult to find any examples from Islamic culture, but you can see these two, where the underworld is represented with hybrid creatures, which are similar to demons in other cultures, and also fire. One of the best known examples of catabasis is Dante's Divine Comedy, and the illustration of Gustave Doré are very, very excellent in this regard. Dante represented the three realms of the world, like a Babel Tower, and the top part is the paradise, and then the middle part is the earth, and the underground is the underworld or hell. And there are several spheres, nine spheres corresponding to the known planets. So the representation has a cosmic structure linking our world to other worlds above us. As we mentioned, the underworld is usually populated by monsters and demons that very frequently eat humans. Most of the representations from Middle Ages in Christian thought show the devil eating humans. They also paint him sometimes in green color. It's interesting because green is the color of envy for Christianity. It symbolizes Satan's fall because of his pride, and he wanted to be like God. These are other representations of the devil from different artists. This is Giotto. You can also find Robert Mapplethorpe, Italian Devil, at the Guggenheim Museum. The Codex Gigas Acca Devil Bible, which is the largest manuscript in the world dedicated to the devil. This other sculpture is in Madrid, in the Retiro Park in Spain. And interesting, the paintings of, again, William Blake. This one is at the Getty Museum, because William Blake traditionally represents the devil not as a sort of a monster, but before the fall, as a revolutionary angel who rebelled against the power of God. This representation of the devil became very popular in the Romantic period as a sort of representing revolution against power. These are other representations at the Baptistery in Florence, mosaics, and also the ceiling mosaic with the angels. In one of them we have the devils, the underworld, and the other one it's all the different circles of the angels. This one is a very famous Garden of the Lys by Bosch, and it's a triptych where we have paradise. In the center we have earth, and in the other side we have the underworld, always in black and with the traditional representation of monsters and so on. This is a detail of the Garden of the Lys by Bosch, and on one side, and on the other side you can see one representation by Indian art. And in Indian art, and it's similar, they use again satanic figures or winged figures. They usually can fly, and they are normally associated with some kind of reptile or a snake or dragon that accompanies them. In this case, you can see that how his body is covered with some kind of scales. These are more representations, in this time now not of the underworld, but of heaven, and the different types of angels that we have. The seraphims, they are the burning ones and the most radiant ones, and they surround the throne of God. Then we have the cherubims, and we mentioned the cherubs. They are usually protecting the tree of life, and they are represented sometimes as eyes. And the cherubims also have 4 faces, one of man, ox, lion, and eagle. And in the Christian Bible, in the New Testament, they represent the 4 Gospels, the 4 evangelists. Angels are sometimes represented as warriors, and because they are with a snake, and shields because they are guarding God. There, you can see in this one, for example, also the representation of the eyes, how they are looking at what's happening in the earth in order to judge people. Here we have several representations of angels, one by William Blake. In this case is Satan. And remember I mentioned that for Blake, he paints Satan as the rebellious angel. So he has not become a monster yet. And you also have the angelic circles surrounded God from Dante's Paradise. This is the illustration by Gustave Doré. In this one you have the ladder. Remember we mentioned the ladder or the staircase. And this is a Russian icon representing the rise to heaven. And then some examples of the angel of death also on the other side. These are contemporary examples of angelic figures and of transcendence by Maurice Denis. And you can see how they are modernist in style, and some of them they decorate this chapel in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, which is outside Paris. And these are by Alex Gray, and they are more psychedelic. But they continue to use some of the elements that we have already seen. Angelic figures are represented winged with wings. Sometimes they are represented with eyes. And this can be seen on the painting called Collective Vision by and you can see how if you look in detail, each of what seems to be circles surrounded this very, very strong light in the center. They are faces and eyes. So they are all the circles of angels surrounded the central figure of light, which would be God. And on the other painting, we can also see the spiral. So remember, the spiral was also used not only to represent the labyrinth, but sometimes to represent fire and the sun, and then God associated with the sun. In some paintings, for example, these ones by Anne McCoy, we can see examples of syncretism again. So she mixes beliefs from Sumerian, Egyptian, other cultures. An element that is very prominent is water and the boat you can see there. Remember we mentioned that in some cultures, for example in the Egyptian culture or the Celtic culture, in order to get to the other side, to reach transcendence and to reach paradise, you have to cross some kind of water element. This occurs traditionally in cultures associated to water. For example, in Egypt, where the River Nile had very important influence, or in the Celtic culture, which, of course, it's characteristic of Ireland and England and some parts of France were particularly surrounded by water. This is by Jade Dafeo, and she calls this the rose, but it's really like a kind of a star. So the star again symbolizes like the sun. And in this case, they are not paintings, they are like sculpture. And it's interesting how she is able to create this effect of shine, even though this is a sculpted material. These are by African artist Betty Saar. Again, we have some of the traditional symbols. Some of these paintings are at Harvard Museum. We have a symbol, for example, of fire. We have the symbol of the eye, very, very prominent there on the large picture, which represents some kind of altar. And we have the snake on the other picture. And the ladder. We also have the moon and the solar disk as well. Many stars and also the spiral. So again, this is an example of syncretism. She mixes traditional African beliefs with Christian beliefs and beliefs from other cultures. The descent of One of the tests we mentioned, that is the catabasis, the descent on the into the underworld. But we also have tests and trials, and this is represented by the labyrinth. We have many types of basically three types of labyrinth. The hermetic labyrinth. This takes the name of Hermes, the Mercury, the god of communication, and the emissary of the gods. And this labyrinth has only has one center, and it consists on several concentric circles. And the Mannerist labyrinth, it's like a binary tree. It has several linear paths and complicated structure with several roots and false promises. And then the contemporary postmodern labyrinth, the rhizomatic labyrinth, which it has no center, it has many centers, and space is created as there's no fixed path. So the path is created as the person walks. So this will be an existential Heideggerian labyrinth. These are some examples from the traditional vision of the labyrinth in Greek mythology, in Crete, the legend of the Minotaur and Theseus. These are some. The labyrinth is a very important motif in architecture, and it has been used in megalithic monuments and contemporary times for gardens. So here in the left we have some examples from Kazakhstan and Astana, and on the right hand side we have an Italian labyrinth. Here are some more examples. Also the Babel Tower was thought to be a labyrinth, and this is one of the Russian palaces, which also has a labyrinth. This is the second type of labyrinth. These are the first type of labyrinth, also in Russia, in a small remote island near the White Sea, where there is the highest concentration of ancient labyrinth on the planet. And they are the first type, the hermetic labyrinth. We have many writers who have dedicated interest to this topic. These are some examples: Athanasius Kirchner, Borges, Kate Moss, etc. These are contemporary examples of the labyrinth. Piet Mondrian, different types. This is Jean Miro, Blue Labyrinth. He also designed a garden labyrinth for the Foundation Meg in France. This is famous Guernica by Picasso. Here you can see some of the elements that we have mentioned. We have the bull, symbolizing Baal as well, the god from the Babylonians, which was later condemned in the Bible. And we have the eye which is also the sun. Here is by Dali. It's also a labyrinth. In this case, we have like the trees forming the labyrinth. Remember, the trees were the axis mundi. On the right hand side on one side of the painting, you can see that the trees are dead. And then we have a kind of a throne in the center, which also has the symbol of death on it. These are, again, many labyrinths by Paul Klee, mind labyrinths. He tries to do some three-dimensional labyrinths as well. Here, Jaroslav Janikowski, Labyrinth of the Mind. And these are some projects by Jim Buchanan. Also, all of them focus on the labyrinth. And also by Polish painter Jacek Jerka, this painting. This one is by surrealist artist Marcel Duchamp, and he creates this kind of labyrinths with strings, 16 miles of string. These are by Leonora Carrington, this British artist who later lived in Spain and in Latin America, and she uses frequently the labyrinth in her works, also to represent her difficulties, or her psychological difficulties. Her friend, Remedios Varo, Argentinian as well, she uses the labyrinth to represent her physical difficulties in struggling with rheumatic pain. So you can identify here almost like what it looks like a wheelchair. She calls it animal fantastico, but it looks like a wheelchair. And, well, several examples of labyrinths of the mind. So in this case, the labyrinth is, like I said, sometimes suffering, it's pain, it's a way to reach transcendence. This is another example by Remedios Varo with the 3 destinies, these women creating the destinies of the world by threading. And it also looks like all these towers have a kind of a labyrinthic outlook. Labyrinths are found in architectural buildings. They are very much part of the work by Cornelis Escher, where he tries to create 3-dimensional labyrinths, also to represent the way our mind works. These are by Joseph Thompson, more contemporary artist, using also like figurative and cubist elements. This one by Matoe Yamamoto, Japanese artist, who uses salt. Salt has crystal patterns that arrange themselves automatically, creating kind of labyrinth that you see on water. This is by Richard Long. It symbolizes the road to Compostela in Spain, which is a meditative path, very long trip that people take in order to do penance and to reach transcendence. And this is a more contemporary example from Guillermo del Toro's movie Pan's Labyrinth, 2006, where we again have some of the elements that we have previously seen, the bull, the spiral, and so on. These are from Queen Maeve's in Ireland. Queen Maeve also was thought to enter a labyrinth where the monster was also some kind of bull. These are some views of the area in Knocknaria where she was thought to have. On the top image, you can see an image from this movie. On the top, you can see an image from the movie called Westworld. It's a television series by Netflix. One of the protagonists is Maeve. This scene seems to point to the myth of Queen Maeve in Ireland, where there was, as I mentioned, an important labyrinth as well. These are some images from the movie, and labyrinth is an important metaphor in this movie. These are again some images from Escher. This book by Gödel, by Douglas Hofstadter, where he talks about the mind, our human mind, as a strange loop where we enter in kind of circularities of thought. And he uses the work of Escher as well as the musician Bach and the physician Gödel. Gödel was a mathematician and physicist who tried to explain how you could travel back in time. And Hofstadter uses these 3 examples in order to illustrate the way our mind works. These are installations of pollen by a German artist, Wolfgang Leib, and he shapes them in the form as a labyrinth, and he uses some of the elements we have already mentioned. And you can see there the triangle, the pyramid, and they are little boats. So the boats are full of pollen, and the boats symbolize the traveling of to the realm of paradise, to the transcendence. This is another example of a Leib using this very, very simplistic technique, and we connecting to what we have mentioned about a via negativa, negative way, meditative, very little representation, so that the audience it's encouraged to meditate and pray. And this is by Indian artist Viswas, where he locked himself in this box in the museum in order to see the reaction of people around him. He calls this experiment CAT. He's trying to test Schrodinger's idea that the experiment of isolating the cat from the world is not possible, because always there is connection between all the elements of the world. So whoever is watching the box is going to be worried whether the person inside is dead or alive, and is going to want to do something about it. So it's not going to be, the box is not going to be completely isolated. So here is another picture of how the box is almost interpreted as a sort of a getaway to another dimension, to the transcendental dimension. This is an image of Kaaba, Mecca, where we clearly have the box, and we clearly have the labyrinth made by people praying around this kind of box, and how all the elements here are connected into creating an element of prayer and ritual to reach the transcendent, to reach heaven or paradise.